Good evening. Welcome to the latest installment of Building the Scottish State, and I have the great pleasure to have with me Jason, or Jagget, as you go about on Twitter. So first of all, thanks for being with us this evening.
Mark, thanks for having me on the show. Yeah,
well, first of all, just tell us a little bit about your own personal history, how you became involved in Scottish independence, and why you're so passionate about it, and your blog, and just give us a few minute summary of your existence.
Well, the long and the short of it is, before 2014. Living in Dublin, I heard in 2012 that we would be having an independence referendum. I got in touch with the Scottish government and asked how I would go about getting a postal vote. And they said, no, you can't have one because you don't live here, which I have no issue with. I think that is a great idea. But as a Scot, as a passionate independentista, I thought, I'm not having that. If I can't vote, I'm going to set up a blog. I'm going to start some online activism. And if I'm not going to vote, I'm going to have a couple of hundred people at least voting on my behalf. Mm-hmm. So I started quite early on, started a Facebook page, which I can't even remember the name of, but it was fairly basic activism.
Yeah.
After the referendum, I was enthused and inspired by this whole movement. So I then collaborated with a number of other people and worked on the Butterfly Rebellion. Mm. And as time moved on, I felt the best thing that I could do was come out of anonymity and become myself, Jason Michael McCann and Jagget, and started tweeting and then blogging on my own account. Okay. And that's pretty much how I got here.
And so what did you do during the 2014, prior to the 2014 referendum? Well, you had a Facebook page? Did you, because I'll just go this in parallel, because myself, I live in France. My father was Scottish. And then when and like you, when I heard, oh, there was this, they had in 2011, the SNP won the majority, and they're going to have a referendum. And for me, who has always loved Scotland and always been interested in it, I'd never even thought about independence. And like the first thing I thought was like, fuck, if Scotland's going to be independent, they should have a good written constitution rather than this bullshit unwritten whatever the hell they have in Westminster. And so that got me interested. And then I was, I made contacts and I wrote to the Scottish Parliament. I got about a written constitution. I got put in touch with people here in Scotland, like Elliot Bulmer and John Drummond. I visited them, and I started writing for Newsnet Scotland back between 2012 and 2014, and did a regular column for them. I was like, look, come on. And for me, it was like, looking at Scotland, it was like I was like me, America, being in Scotland, as in a bar, and then there's this beautiful girl over the other side, called independence, and Scotland sitting next to me. I was like, come on, man, go for it. What are you doing? Go on, man. What are you doing? Go for it. And they're like, oh, I don't know. What are we going to do about the currency? It's like, you invented the world. I mean, all these amazing inventions, David Hume, all this stuff comes from Scotland. And you think you can't, and you have these doubts that you can govern yourself effectively. I was just dumbfounded. And so I entered it thinking, oh, of course, it's a no-brainer. Duh, of course you want independence. And then you meet people that have these doubts about it, and they're like, what? How did you see it? How did you?
Well, I had serious doubts. I've believed in Scottish independence my entire life. I mean, I grew up in an SNP voting household in Kilmarnock. I grew up as part of the Irish diaspora that had very little truck with Westminster. But one of the hang-ups of belonging to the Irish diaspora is, of course, where the majority of Irish diaspora kids and the population in Scotland is Catholic. Yeah. And we've had a fairly, what would you say, problematic or tumultuous relationship with other Scots. And not just Protestant Scots, native, ancestrally Catholic Scots. We were seen as Irish Catholic incomers. We were always a strangely outside population within the nation. And of course, sectarianism is no secret. So as early as 2012, when I began to think about independence as a realistic prospect, as something worth plumbing for, my initial fear was that we would end up in an independent Scotland with a sizable Catholic minority led by a sectarian government, because let's not go down the lines of denying sectarianism in Scotland. There are many, many relationships culturally with what has happened in Ulster, in the north of Ireland, the occupied 6 counties. So my initial hang-up was that at least Westminster hates Scots equally. You know, whether you're Presbyterian, Episcopalian, Baptist, Methodist, it doesn't matter. Westminster just hates Scots. My fear was that we would end up with a Catholic population governed by a majority that hate Catholics, and that would be problematic. But as I was proven wrong, as time developed through the rise of the independence movement from 2012, watching it closely, I got to see that the old sectarianism was very, very much part of the fuel of unionism. And the dynamism of the Yes movement was incredibly inclusive, incredibly young. And we still see, and it's become problematic for a number of reasons now, that, it has attracted to itself, everything that's nominally progressive, whatever progressive means. But at the time, it was beautiful, it was vibrant, it was inclusive. And I was, I was sold on it. I thought, this is the independence I would like to see born in Scotland, a Scotland for everyone, who is part of the nation and contributes to the common good, or the common weal. And yeah, I completely sold on it. So that was my only hang up. And I had to learn from the beginning that this would be a proper inclusive idea of independence. And once I found my comfort in that, I thought, well, like you, what's not to go for? But as someone who grew up in Scotland, I understand the natural, what I would describe as, a sort of crypto unionism, and doesn't make the.
What do you mean by that? If you could describe it, what do you mean by crypto unionism?
Well, I mean, we would. Oh, how do you describe a term? I've used it quite often in the past. It would sort of be the sense that human beings sort of ingest and are nourished by what is seen as the normative politics or the normative philosophy of a society. And in Scotland, the normative values are unionist. They are British. We want independence, but we wear the poppy. We want independence, but we will, we want the monarchy. All these great institutions and hangovers of an imperial past. And I just see it as a horrible admission of something that's historically not real, is that, well, we benefited from the British Empire. No, we didn't. Scotland's upper class, like England's upper class, benefited from the empire.
And so many people who lived, in the Highlands and Islands and others migrated to Glasgow, or others to build ships, including my own great grandparents, and whether they had a better life, I don't know. I don't know whether it was better to live in the island of Islay or come to Glasgow and work in the Fairfield shipyards. I have no idea, but I don't think it was necessarily by their own choice, and it was at the service of the empire at the time.
I mean, we saw a process of. I mean, I fight with a lot of people on this, or have done in the past. I mean, I unapologetically describe the process, or the processes of the Highland clearances and the Lowland clearances as a genocide. Many people will argue with that it didn't involve mass killings.
I don't think it has to involve, necessarily mass killings. It's getting people out, ethnic cleansing, I mean.
As genocide was defined at Nuremberg and in international law thereafter, genocide is not a historical definition. Genocide is a legal definition, and the legal definition says that if you kill one single person for the purposes of diminishing or destroying that ethnic group, that is legally defined as genocide. So legally speaking, what happened in the clearances was genocidal. And of course, it was perpetrated by Scots, but it was perpetrated by Scots for the good of Britain. They were acting as imperial collaborationists. So this we saw the same happen in Hungary during the Second World War. You know, it wasn't the SS or the Einsatzgruppen or the Nazis who murdered the Jews of Estonia or got rid of the Jews out of Slovakia or out of Hungary. These were native administrations. If you look at the export of Jews from Drancy in France, this was the French
under the Vichy regime.
Of course, this was the French, the Vichy collaborationists. So this argument of well, Scots did it to Scots. Well, Scots did it to Scots.
You hear the same argument in the slave trade. Well, there were a lot of blacks that enslaved blacks and then sent them to, you hear the same thing in so many different.
So I mean,
the point is, who was the main, organizer of all of these? Whether
I certainly look at the historical. The historical development of what we understand as modern Scotland as a unionist normative project that English unionists and Scottish unionists who proved their worth to London were put in key positions in the Kirk. Now, we like to talk about the Kirk as not having the monarch as the head.
Tell me more about the Kirk. I mean, I know that.
Well, I don't know. I'm not an expert. I am a theologian.
I mean, just what you know. I mean, as far as I know, it was kind of these self-governing, kind of paroisses, as we say in French, or parishes, where the church was kind of a local administration, and the Presbyterian church in Scotland is that how you understand it? Or I mean, I know so very little. I'm just wondering if you.
I only understand the Presbyterian order as an outsider looking in, and that is the best I could say. But what it broadcasts itself as a church that's free of temporal monarchic leadership, and on paper that's true. Though, like every church, my own church included, like the Anglican Church in England, like churches tend to align themselves formally with those in power, and the Church of Scotland is no different. Certainly, as we saw recently with Prince William arriving and being the new crown visitor to the Church of Scotland is
it's weird.
It's a very weird thing, but it if anything, it demonstrates this idea of normative unionism in Scotland. And that's what I mean by crypto-unionists. A crypto-unionist can be someone who fully supports independence, will vote for independence, but their imagination has been formed by a unionist education system, a unionist set of values, a unionist set of notions about the history and narrative of British imperialism. And the way we talk about it is though Scottish industrialism was great. Weren't we great hard workers when we had shipyards and we were the workshop of the world? Well,
it was actually, I know, I've heard that narrative, but it was brutal.
Bonkers, brutal. Utterly brutal. We had human beings living on top of one another, 10, 12 to a single room, dying of cholera, and this was not for our enrichment. Scotland was not enriched by being an imperial powerhouse. Scotland, if anything, we were wage slaves in the proper Marxist sense.
Yeah, you had. I mean, you had a few that benefited from it. In Glasgow, in the merchants' quarter, all that with these beautiful houses. There were built that had slave, it had slave plantations in Jamaica with tobacco and cotton and that stuff. But people like my grandparents. I mean, I don't know what their life was like, but they lived in tenements in Govan. I'm sure it wasn't easy peasy at all.
No, not at all.
Absolutely brutal conditions.
It was utterly brutal. But these what would you say, the beneficiaries of industrial unionism or British imperialism were the same collaborationists we see in every society under any form of colonial administration, that this was the moneyed class. And okay, there are outliers. I made the comment recently that wealthy people are more likely to be unionists, and I got a great deal of kickback, and rightly so, because there are people, you know, middle-class people and incredibly wealthy people who are supporters of independence. But the distinction I would like to make is those who benefit economically from any given system are less likely to wish to change that system. That's textbook. We look at Scotland and we get to see that the people who stand to, and this is why I describe myself as an accelerationist, the people who stand to benefit the most from independence expedited, hurried up, and this is my main issue, of course, with the SNP. The people who stand to benefit the most from it being sped up are the people who are right now digging between the cushions in their sofa looking for a 50p piece in order to buy a tin of potatoes or beans to feed children. And those people exist in Scotland.
I know.
And sadly, many of those are crypto unionists because they're fed on this diet of the Daily Mail, the Daily Record, or the Daily Redcoat, as I like to call it. You know, this media poison propaganda.
It's unbelievable.
It's despicable.
I'd like to, I guess, get onto that. I had in the early 90s, I spent the summer of 91 and 92 in Glasgow I had a girlfriend on the east end of Glasgow. I spent a lot of time with her family, lovely people, you know, very Catholic. And they bought the Daily Record every day, and I was reading it, and I was I'd read, I was educated from the United States, read the New York Times, read the Economist, and I was reading the Daily Record. I was like, what is this shit? It was unbelievable. It was just trying to ram ideas into your brain, and I was explaining that to my the father of my girlfriend at the time. Was like, this stuff is trying to indoctrinate you. Stuff is trying to tell you what to think, and he agreed. These are just faint memories I have it, but I was just amazed, that there's that kind of media, and that was early 90s, and the internet didn't exist, all that stuff. But I was just like, oh my God, what do the Scottish people live under in terms of media? And then the BBC. I mean, we don't have to get going on that. Spend all night talking about it. But I mean, the media in my view, just very quickly, the media in Scotland for decades has been designed to keep the mentality cowering. We can't do this, we can't do that. And then you look at the Daily Record, this person killed, this horrible thing happened, there was this awful thing. It's like, what are you doing? There's so many beautiful people in Scotland. Why don't I actually talk about nice, good people instead of all this grim crime, football, hooliganism, whatever that is part of that is the Daily Record, that is especially the tabloids with the BBC as well. I mean, you know it better than I do because you've lived there longer. But what is your view on that?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't say that this has been going on for decades. This has been going on for centuries. If you look at articles from the Scotsman newspaper from the height of the Highland clearances, you will get to see
what year would that be roughly?
All the way through the early 19th century towards the late 19th century. Okay. I mean, it reached certain peaks of clearance, but arguably the Highland clearances are still happening, at least in an economic sense. That it was a formal modernization after the period of the Irish famine, in which, there was a racial narrative of the Gaelic Scot, the Catholic or Episcopalian Scot who needed to be removed from the land. And at the time, in the 1860s and 70s, the Scotsman newspaper was describing them as an inferior race and describing in quite open terms to replace this population with a better Teutonic stock. And that's an actual quote. So this, none of this media campaign in Scotland is new. It's as old. In fact, there's a couple in Scotland who run the Random History Project. You've maybe heard of, and they've published.
No, I haven't, but I'd be interested in reading it. Yeah.
Marvelous stuff. I'm in touch with the young lady who works on that. I'm sure her name's Jenny. If I've got it wrong, I apologize. But they've published a whole series of newspaper articles relating to, contemporaneous with the Treaty of Union and moving on through the centuries since. And it shows in fantastic detail how Scotland has been trained how to think, or
indoctrinated,
how not to think.
Yeah.
How to think of ourselves as divided, how to think of ourselves as ethnically and intellectually inferior. And the Daily Record is just a later iteration of this behaviour. Yeah. If in Ireland, I find it, hilarious that, of course, Ireland has tabloid newspapers, but we don't have anti-Irish tabloid newspapers now.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Anti-French tabloid newspapers do not exist in France. Anti-German tabloid newspapers don't exist in Germany.
Yeah.
Etc. But it's unique in the Scottish context is I can show an Irish person a copy of the Daily Record. They will read 2 articles or 2 columns and look back and say, why do Scottish people tolerate this? If I was reading in the Irish Independent something, pouring poison, now it's okay, criticism is one thing. This is why I make so many enemies online. I am all in favour of criticising the Scottish government. I am all in favour of criticising Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon. Everyone's open to criticism. That's what real journalism is about.
Sure.
I'm not up for pouring toxins and poison onto the very idea of Scotland's ability to think for itself, to have its own politicians, to have its own democracies. Yeah. That's what the Daily Record does.
I know.
That's what it does. That's its job. And if we look at the charter of, I'm when I say I'm writing a book, this is a long-term project, but I'm in the middle of writing a chapter just now on the media in particular. And it begins by focusing on the charter of the BBC. The BBC's charter is extremely explicit that the purpose of the BBC is to defend or push the greater cohesion of British society. That's so in its charter, that's its job.
Yeah.
So the BBC, by its charter, is not going to give an honest appraisal of British behaviour in the north of Ireland, which, let's face it, it's on record. It's now a matter of historical and legal fact that Britain has perpetrated a number of a number of massacres in the north of Ireland in our lifetime. It happened.
Yeah.
That's not on the BBC. The BBC is not, it may mention it, it may talk about the outcome of the Savile inquiry, it may talk about the Ballymurphy inquiry, but it will not tell you why it happened. It will not tell you what was the thinking of the government, because that would be inimical to the cohesion of the British state.
Yeah.
And the BBC is there to do the opposite.
Yeah.
And we find that there's an overspill from the BBC into the Daily Mail, the Daily Record, and all of these other, by and large, unionist newspapers, unionist news outlets. And they behave very much like the BBC. In fact, they act as the outriders of the BBC because they've got to curry favour, because that's how their editors get lordships. It's how they get their writers like Boris Johnson, who can one day be a columnist and the next day prime minister.
It's so insanely corrupt. It's just,
it's insidious. It's insidious, and few other countries have anything like it.
Well, in fact, and not every country has Rupert Murdoch as this. Well, several countries actually do. Have Rupert Murdoch as this media mogul who is able
Rupert Murdoch is not the problem. Rupert Murdoch is a handy byword for corrupt tabloid media. Rupert Murdoch is interested in money. That's it. If it sells papers, he will back any side. We've seen that with the Sun newspaper switching sides on issues. whatever side sells the most newspapers, Rupert Murdoch will support. He, you know, at a certain level of wealth, you become transcendent.
I see it a bit differently, because I think he has such a huge influence in Australia, in the United States. We don't have to get into that. We don't have to get into that. So it's not. But I think it's beyond money. I think it's more to do with, you know, pushing corporate influence and making sure that the corporations win out. And
which is money.
Yeah,
which
true. I agree with that.
Is the superstructural ideology of money. He is there to push money interest and neoliberalism.
Yeah.
And if Nicola Sturgeon promised Rupert Murdoch a perfectly neoliberal shock doctrine Scotland, Rupert Murdoch would be right in there.
Yeah, I agree with that. I cannot disagree with that at all. Yeah.
Well, it's just true. It's not. Let me be arrogant. This is just a fact. Yeah. Rupert Murdoch is there for the business interest, so he'll back any horse that will further his agenda. The real problem with the British media is that it is very much a captured media, and it is there as an instrument of political. It's a political weapon of the British state, and has been since the earliest days of pamphlets and newspapers in the UK.
Yeah. Okay. I see that there's several questions, but I kind of want to go on between 2014 and now in terms of the independence movement, and then at the end we'll get to the questions that have been posed. So, what do you see? Okay, so 2014, I remember being in the Emirates Arena. It was a weird experience, because I was with Independence Live. I was doing interviews, the first live stream interviews in Scottish history. We got put into the Library of Scotland, and it was weird because I had a big on my elbow. I had this huge infection that blew up during the night of the referendum. And in the morning, I went back at like 6 in the morning, and I was supposed to do an interview. I think it was on Al Jazeera or something later in the day. And I called my cousin who I was staying with. I said, dude, I got this big, infection. He said, go to hospital now, which I did, and then I spent the night in the hospital. And that was the night that the evening that there was the big riots in, George Square. But it was just insane, because on the way to the Emirates Arena, I went through George Square, and it was the most amazing experience. I had my kilt on. There was this woman that came up and put on painted a Scottish flag on my cheek. And everybody was waving flags. It was just amazing. And then the next morning, this is a beautiful. The next morning, I got a taxi back to George Square, and a guy, a bus driver, came to me. And he said, and I met him later, and he remembered this experience directly. And he said, and he was a bus driver, and for taking people around the countryside. And he said, what won the referendum? And it's like, oh man, the no did. And he said, oh great, now I got to go on the bus and explain what a great country we have. Because we voted no. It was I was in touch, and it was funny because I met that guy later in a Govan. In Govan, at a cafe, and we remembered that experience. But going from 12 hours before George Square, beautiful painting flags, all that, to George Square, oh my God, what have we done? How are we, how am I going to explain this to my Japanese tourists, kind of thing. Yeah. So, that's how I experienced it. But maybe you can tell me a little bit more and how you've seen things since 2014.
Well, I think like everyone else, I'm not affected by it anymore. I think we've all gone through the stages of grief and recovery, but I'm still shaped by the profound sense of failure, heartbreak, loneliness. I mean, I existentially, I was self-destructive after the 19th of September 2014. Mm-hmm. It was profoundly defeating, and that's what drove the Butterfly Rebellion, the website that we created. Was we're not going to give up on this, and I think that that the realist in me knew that we were up against it. Winning independence in 2014 was a tall order. In terms of, and I hate this argument, you know, the real Scottish, the native-born Scottish people did vote for independence in the largest numbers. Well, in the modern world, that doesn't count. There were plenty of English voters, there were plenty of European Union citizens living in Scotland who had a vote, and it's the totality of the democracy that counts.
Sure.
And you know, winning over the full constituency of Scotland was a very tall order. We were, in terms of, as we've discussed, the media, we were up against, we were up against a media giant that was, you know, it was breathing fire by the time Gordon Brown got on the stage and was talking about, you know, spouting lies, the same lies he's talking about federalism and Devo Max, because, you know, like Indy and like Devo Max, every political concept needs to be sold to the Scottish people as though it's a child's sweet. Devo Max. You know, Devo Max sounds stupid. It's, you know, why don't we call it like a grown-up term like federalism? You know, at least that way.
Or even better, explain what it means.
Yeah, of course.
And even better, like deliver it.
You know, it's this. One of my bugbears is, you know, anyone who looks at me on Twitter will be familiar with. I utterly hate the term indie. You know, INDY, because it's an infantilization of what independence is, and it also has the power of reducing independence to a single thing. North Korea is an independent state. We don't want that. You know, the United States of America is an independent state or collection of states, a federation of states, etc., etc. There are different independences. And when we start using grown-up vocabulary, it allows us to think in a more grown-up and more sophisticated and nuanced way about what we mean. And it allows access then for political theory to take shape. So when I speak to someone about independence, you know, when it's shaped by a singular notion of Indy, it's about anything at all just to break with England. Well, that's not good enough. I mean, we could break from England and become, as we were saying, you know, Rupert Murdoch's perfectly neoliberal, you know, shock doctrine state. Well, actually, I'd much rather, you know, I'd rather not have independence. If that's the cause. Exactly. You know, it's jumping from the frying pan into the fire. If we want to be independent and become like North Korea, well, you know, not for that either. You know, there are some things worse than death, quite frankly. And, you know, so in terms of language, we've moved on from 2014, you know, and this is, you know, the great threat that we saw in 2014 was division. Don't be divisive. Don't divide the movement. Don't divide the yes vote. And really that was saying, let's have groupthink. Let's think as an automaton. We vote yes, we vote no. Utterly, you know, rubbish. You know, that there are different political ideas all in this pot, all looking for independence in order to ply their, you know, their various politics. And that's the reality of any mature democracy. You know, and of course there's great rifts now in the independence movement arising from the last Holyrood election, because we are beginning to see a real, I hesitate to say conflict, but for lack of a better term, I don't mean, you know, we're
schism, that works, right? Yes,
but you know, it comes with a fair amount of teeth bearing at one another. That, you know, there is a real schism between people who, you know, trust the SNP, and I'm not saying that there are no reasons to trust the SNP. You know, they sing the right songs, they're saying the right words, but then there are other people who are saying, well, why the delay? Why one excuse after another? Why, you know, the definition of insanity is to try the same thing over and over again, hoping for it.
Yeah, and we've had, how many mandates has the SNP had for another referendum?
Well, all of these things, you know, and then of course, you know, people who were on my side, and my side isn't a side, my side is also another umbrella group of different politics, you know, coming under a different, you know, the auspices of another political grouping. You know, we are getting in the neck for supporting Alex Salmond, you know, that great sex pest, deviant, evil.
Yeah, that was found guilty, and oh God, I really wish we could freely talk about what happened to him and the conspiracy.
Well, why don't we? I mean, why don't we? We don't need to be conspiracy theorists.
Yeah.
But in terms of, you know, my quote unquote support, or, you know, being a fanboy, or, you know, making Alex Salmond a god, I'm no more, you know, in support of Alex Salmond than I am of Nicola Sturgeon. What I believed in was the creation of a supermajority in the Scottish Parliament that would fundamentally change the political dynamics in Scotland, and would create a circumstance that history has shown worked. It happened in Dublin in 1919 when a supermajority was elected. And I would go further, that I would say that such a supermajority should be abstentionist in character. That, you know, we make such a big deal about Holyrood being our parliament. Holyrood is no more our parliament than Westminster is. You know, we get to see that when Nicola Sturgeon, you know, this anti-monarchist, this pro-independence woman.
I saw this lovely procession of her today with the other, royal guards going on, and I could see she didn't have a good look on her face, but in my view, she humiliated herself by, going to see, William, and
well, look, okay, I'm not going to target Nicola Sturgeon in particular here. Alex Salmond has done the same. Tommy Sheridan has done the same. That you will stand and you will make an oath of allegiance to Her Majesty the Queen of England, to her heirs and successors in law. Well, okay, people will argue and say, well, you don't need to mean the oath. You just need to say the words. Just say the words and you can take your seat. Well, what that means is, on day one of taking up their seat to represent me as my elected official, they have shown themselves to be a liar. Well, okay, let's have a parliament full of Republican liars. I don't want one of them. So I would go further and say that I supported a supermajority. I wish to see that supermajority being abstentionist in nature. And like what happened in Dublin 1919, they would walk away from a Westminster devolved parliament in Edinburgh. That's what this is constitutionally. This is not the Scottish Parliament. This devolves its power from Westminster, where the Crown is sovereign. Not the people of Scotland, no matter what preamble Nicola Sturgeon or any other MSP gives to their board.
They're under the Scotland Act. They have to swear allegiance to the Queen. That's it.
Yes. So what I would be in favour of is gaining that supermajority and walking a mile down the road to a hotel or a conference centre and convening the independent Parliament of Scotland. And its first act would be to, propose and to support and to vote on the independence of the Scottish Republic. I have this was, I may be quite a lonely voice in this, but that's what I wanted, and the only party that offered that.
I think you'll find a lot of people agree with you. It's just that the Scottish people haven't really been asked in a meaningful way of what they really
and of course there is a natural temerity, because what we hear very often on social media is this sense of don't rock the boat. Let's do one thing at a time. Let's get independence and deal with this after.
I heard it all the time,
Of course. Well, I mean, this is the nature of gradualism. And gradualism, in terms of struggling against, I mean, we can say that, yes, this worked for Slovakia when it separated from Czechia in, was it the late 90s when they separated
early
into
90s,
independent
sometime
when
they
separated into independent countries, it was done as a gradualist process and it was done amicably. Well, it was, and that's fantastic, but that was done outside of the context of colonialism. Scotland, Slovakia wasn't a colonial imperial possession of Czechia. Prague didn't dominate Slovakia. They separated. They were the creation of a post-World War I settlement. Scotland is different. And I will argue until I'm blue in my face, for one reason only. We have oil. And we are,
and a parking space for the nuclear weapons. That's...
Well, you can park them in Wales. Ultimately, what is it? Helensburgh is a movable feast. But we are the only part of the UK that produces still the world's leading geopolitical resource, oil. And the English state is not going to relinquish that without a fight.
I know.
And again, this is followed with a great deal of naivety that, again, I see in the narrative that what happened in Ireland, Ballymurphy, Derry, Bloody Sunday, etc., that this could never happen in Scotland because somehow these are modern times. Well, this week, we got to see Dominic Cummings describe the utter calculated cruelty and indifference and contempt for human life that the British government has for people living in London.
Yeah.
And if we think that they have any more care for who gets shot with a rubber bullet in George Square or with live ammunition as what happened in Derry, that's how the British state operates. But okay, dealing with a disease is quite different to using ammunition and munitions and warfare against civilians, of course. So then we can look at another thing that's happening this week, and it's happening in Gaza, where we've got the Israeli government bombing a crowded city of 2 million people, massive civilian casualties, over 200. You know, I think the numbers of children dead are colossal. And what's not being discussed in Scotland, but is being discussed here in Ireland, where the Irish government described this as an illegal annexation, was that the British government, through its arms deals, is currently making about £40 million per murdered Palestinian child. Now, that shows you Britain's attitude to armed violence against civilian populations.
Well,
and this is,
that's not, certainly nothing new given their imperial history.
Of course, and of course, this is why the American government. After the Good Friday Agreement, specifically employed the services of the British state in Afghanistan and Iraq, because the British Army, you know, this will get me a lot of boos from the gallery, but you know, it's historically true. The British Army couldn't fight its way out of a paper bag. You know, the British Army fled. I mean, the narrative is we won the Second World War, but you know,
no, we Americans saved your ass.
Of course,
you'd be speaking German if it wasn't for us.
met with the Blitzkrieg in the summer of 1940. The British Army was fleeing to Dunkirk and getting out of there as fast as it could. You know, and if it hadn't gotten out of there, it would have nothing for the landing at D-Day. Historically, the British Army is not a continental fighting force. It's nothing. But the skill set that the British Army does have that the Americans don't, and that the Americans needed for Iraq and Afghanistan, was Britain, through its experience of Northern Ireland and Gibraltar and India and all of these other theatres of colonial imperial domination, knows how to intimidate, control, and terrorise civilian populations. That is what the British Army does. And it does it, it's expert. It's the world's leading terrorist organization in terms of keeping a civilian population behaving itself. So this happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. We now have today, again, this isn't ancient history, today we now have the House of Commons putting through legislation to indemnify and protect human rights violators in the British Army from prosecution. So somehow we now think that tomorrow, if Scotland declared independence, that the British Army would behave differently because tomorrow is somehow different from what the British Army did in Afghanistan, Iraq, is now doing in Gaza, and did in Northern Ireland or the north of Ireland until extremely recently. That takes a massive amount of naivety. And it's at that naivety I begin to lose patience with this very polite middle-class Scottish notion of independence, where our people in suits will negotiate with their people in suits, we'll all be very, very friendly with one another, and we'll get our independence, and Britain will be happy with that, and be happy to give up the oil. Well, you need to be soft in the head to think that that is even nearly an approximation of how Britain will behave faced with losing that resource. Simple.
Yeah. Okay. Wanted to get to the questions. Let's see. Well, I'd love to go on, of course, but do you think SNP will keep the monarchy after independence, and will and surely it will split their core members? What do you think about the possibility I think we're being presumptuous saying the SNP will bring us independence, but upon independence, what do you think about the difference between a republic and a monarchy?
Oh, do you want to deal with that in 15 minutes? First of all, the SNP, historically, the SNP is not a pro-independence party. That may come as a shock to a lot of people, But at the creation of the SNP, one of the first jobs of the SNP in the 30s was to get rid of what John McCormack, one of the founding members of the SNP, described as the wild men of independence. That the purpose of the SNP in its cradle was about a better deal for Scotland, probably something along the lines of home rule. Mm-hmm. Now that tendency, a political tendency in the proper sense, has existed in the SNP throughout. It has become, in large part, a pro-independence party, and I'm not going to deny that. However, it's an incredibly middle-class pro-independence movement, and that's why I see the delay. The current leadership, or the prevailing ideology, which is very business-orientated, which is quite neoliberal, the prevailing ideology of the Scottish National Party is to delay independence until an independence that it wants can be secured. Yeah. And to me, in the Gramscian sense, that this would be the transfer of power from one ruling class to another. It certainly wouldn't benefit ordinary working people, no more than it would, you know, your average working, or dare I say unemployed person living in a flat in Glasgow is not going to be any better off under an independent neoliberal SNP Scotland. Also, in terms of how it proposes to go about independence, it's painfully, I mean, visit to the dentist, painfully gradualist. It has never once mentioned the monarchy. In fact, it's sort of cozying up to this pantomime with the Kirk recently and Prince William and the deference that we get to see it give the monarchy. And let's face it, you know, in a similar parliamentary structure in another devolved part of the United Kingdom, we have the Republican Party Sinn Féin, of which I am a member, which would not give that deference. No. You know, under no circumstances would an oath to, you know, we say that we have to, you know, we absolutely have to take an oath to the Queen to take up our seats in Holyrood.
I never got that. I mean, you know, especially with the
SNP. In Stormont, in Belfast, they don't.
Yeah.
You know, it's not going to happen. So, I mean, there is no reason why we can't make that change in our parliament. But look, the SNP, I don't deny, is a pro-independence party in large part. I would argue that it wants the independence it wants, not necessarily what people in the ground want. And it's not going to explain that to them. It's just going to delay it until it can control, you know, have a controlled demolition
I agree with
of
that.
the British state.
Yeah.
And in that regard, I wouldn't describe them. I'm not going to, I mean, just me using rhetoric to score a point. I'm not going to describe them as monarchists. I don't believe they are monarchists. They're more indifferent to the monarchy. And in that regard, I think independence under the SNP, as things are, will be a Scottish, you know, it'll be an independence in that we become a state, but kind of like Canada or
mini Westminster, still in part of the Commonwealth.
You'll still have a monarch as an English British monarch as head of state, with all of the sort of accesses to power that these people have, even still in Australia. You know, that the Queen can make a phone call to the governor and make sure certain things happen in Australia or Canada or don't. These things still happen, and we don't talk about this. But now we have, you know, what's his name, Billy Battenberg, Prince William, now in Holyrood Palace.
Yeah, meeting up with Gordon Brown and, you know.
Private conversations with influential, or people who have influence within unionist circles. This shows a certain level of political involvement that is pretty dangerous. Yeah. You know, that, okay, the monarchy may not be as active, but it certainly acts as a locus of resistance to the independence movement.
I mean, you know, the idea that they're not active is just absurd.
Oh, they're absolutely activist. You know, they just
well, they do their best to not present themselves in the media as such. But they have the Privy Council. You know, the Prime Minister has a weekly meeting with the monarch. You think they're not political?
Again, they don't have to be. I mean, you or I, we don't have the money or the resources or the access to people. We have to be personally activist. Yeah. The monarchy can sit aloof, make a phone call, and have other people act as its cat's paw. Yeah. You know, and essentially that's how it operates. And that's why Gordon Brown is being called in for a chit chat, because he is part of the monarchy's cat's paw.
Yeah. Okay.
So that would be my answer there. I hope I've answered that question.
Another question. Jason, how do we counterbalance the expectation that there will be an independence referendum within the next 5 years with the reality that there probably won't be due to a lack of preparation to address so many of the areas requiring satisfactory answers, plus an SNP factor on COVID, council elections, and most likely UK snap elections. So basically, there's a lack of preparation. I'm part of a group that's trying to do preparations, but how do you see that? Just that, I mean, for example, I understand that Marco Biaggi, who was hired by the SNP to lay the groundwork for independence, left in the last couple of days, and they're just not, the SNP hierarchy are definitely not focused on making preparations. So what do we do?
Well, okay, I would split that into two parts if I can and be as quick and as succinct as I can. First of all, the independence within the next 5 years. I'll try and do this dramatically, look to the camera. There is not going to be... We
need better ratings on independence.
Okay.
So
there is not going to be an independence referendum within the next 5 years. Now, that much is absolutely sure. And we can tell this, I mean, anyone who's familiar with, I'm forgetting his name, Noam Chomsky, and others who've described the use of media in politics. I think, what is it? Propaganda and the public is against is we have Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish government, the SNP, engaging in a process of doublespeak. And what I mean by doublespeak is language that has a surplus of meaning. And to give an example to this is, we will prepare for another independence referendum when the COVID-19 emergency, when we have finished the recovery.
That's the same as George Bush after the 9/11 thing, saying we will, and after they had the resolution for the war against terror, saying we will end the war against terror once terror is gone. I mean,
well, I mean that's a less subtle form of doublespeak, but the recovery and the crisis doublespeak that Nicola Sturgeon is right now employing is actually quite clever, because in the midst of a global health emergency, which is in, and no one's denying this, this is true, they're using words like recovery and crisis. Now, that is meant for you and for I to understand recovery from a disease. You know, that when we have recovered from the disease, the pandemic, that should hopefully be within 12 months or 24 months. So as Business for Scotland was saying, yes, we will definitely be rolling into another independence referendum very soon. However, crisis and recovery are not really medical pandemic terms. These are economic terms. When we're talking about recovery from the crisis, it's about an economic crisis. And when we're talking about recovery, we're talking about the recovery from the economic shock. Now, the IMF and a number of other leading globalist organizations describing the economic effect and recovery is, to put this in stark terms, this is a greater dip to the global economy than was the Great Depression of, 1927 and onwards. Mm-hmm. The Scottish economy, I mean, look at what has happened. Not just to Scotland, to all of its trading partners everywhere in the world. The Scottish economy is not going to get to the other side of this so-called V shape, this economic V in terms of growth to GDP. We're not going to get to where we were. This is decades. This is decadal. Mm-hmm. So if we wish to align our recovery, the Scottish economic recovery, to the rest of the UK until we revisit an independence referendum, that's 30 years. Yeah, 30 years. So yes, she's being very clever. It's this carrot thing. Keep voting for me on the promise of independence. We will get to this after the recovery. And people are thinking, oh, right, so we're all about to get vaccinated. Hey, yeah, all vaccinated, but that's not what they mean by recovery. Mm-hmm. You know, disease doesn't really mean much in the working of a nation. or a state. Economy does, and that's what we mean by recovery. Yeah. The other side to that was what was the other part of that question? Was
let me go back.
Independence referendum and
let's see, lack of preparation.
Oh yeah, the lack of where I may be at odds with you, Mark, here is I see all of this as an absolute fugazi. We have to absolutely solve the monetary and the currency question before we can get to independence. Well, no, rubbish. What? This is a fake argument. We live in the modern world. We live in an integrated global economy. Mm-hmm. We can trade in chocolate buttons if we so choose. We know this to be the reality. Slovakia did not have to answer the currency question first. Neither did East Germany. Neither did the imploding Soviet Union.
I agreed, but there's no reason that right now we, Scotland and people like you and me cannot work with other people to draft a draft.
There is
have plans for monetary policy.
There is absolutely nothing to stop us doing that.
Yeah.
But it is not a prerequisite.
True.
So by all means, given
that there's downtime and actually getting independence.
Absolutely. So by all means,
it should be being done, and that's my view.
Of course, it should be, and this is what this. But we have a Scottish government that has accepted or has chosen to accept this idea that this is a prerequisite for independence. That is a piece of nonsense.
Yeah.
That there are certain things that will, there was a sense of panic in Ireland back, I think, 2001, when we made the changeover to the euro from the Irish punt. And there was a sense of panic. How will we manage this? Well, what happened is in the morning that the euro was first released into general circulation, people went to the ATM and withdrew their money, and all of a sudden they were using euro. I
remember that. I did the same in France. I remember going to the ATM
and nothing happened. So what will happen with currency in Scotland, no matter if we're prepared or not prepared, whether we have our own currency, we use the euro or continue to use the pound, or just use, I don't know, use the the Thai currency, as we were free to do. Whatever we do, the transition will be we wake up in the morning, we go to the ATM and we're using that currency, and life will go on. The fugazi, the sort of trick that's being played is that this is an essential component that must come before independence. No, when the rebels in 1916 gathered at the GPO in Dublin to fight proper nasty imperialism, when Gandhi was fighting, the massacres that were happening in India, they didn't have to kind of come together and say, right, lads, but before we kick off the rebellion, we have to talk about currency, because everyone knows the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, these would have all failed if we didn't have a proper currency solution. Nonsense.
My main point I want to do this before the next question is that there's no reason that we can't do planning now.
Absolutely. To me, it comes under this heading of we can walk and chew gum. Exactly. Absolutely. I have nothing against planning for independence. It is a good thing. It is a necessary thing for a grown-up, mature state to do. It's not a prerequisite. My problem isn't dealing with currency. My problem arises when more and more of the electorate and the independence movement are thinking, but we can't go to the next referendum until we've dealt with currency.
I get your
because
point.
The Daily Record told me so.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. I want to get through a few more questions before we wrap it up. Let's see. How do we deal with Scots who are suffering from the Stockholm syndrome of British media? Surely their eyes have been opened within the last year. We've touched on this in our conversation, but how do you? Do you think that the Scottish people have, gotten through something in the last years and seen things differently than they did in 2014? Or how do you see that?
Not well, to be perfectly honest. Scotland is incredibly politically active. No one is denying that. However, and I may get a lot of boos and jeers, and I always do, we're politicized, but by and large still politically behind. I don't want to use a word like ignorant. You know, if I were using the word ignorant, I would be using it in the dictionary definition as just uninformed. This is not a pejorative. I mean, the lack of information in Scotland about democracy and political theory is quite deliberate. The SNP has benefited from it as well, like not explaining the D'Hondt system. It was very funny that the BBC explained the D'Hondt system the day after the vote, not the day before.
I saw that.
It was very important. You know, so we have a movement that's very politically active, very politically aware, very activist, and all of that's to be praised. How many of them can talk about the political theory of gaining independence, or about currency, or about imperialism, or about the racialization of the notion of state and nation? Very few. In fact, it's not really in the discourse. You know, that's what I mean by politically behind.
So just not, I mean, being politically engaged, but not politically engaged in a more totality of things that are very relevant. Yeah.
Now that means that is a good thing. You know, that you definitely need a politically engaged and activist movement. Yes. So in that Scotland gets 5 stars. However, having a politically engaged and activist movement that doesn't have a grassroots understanding of solid political theory, as I would describe, doesn't have a political ideology,
right? You
know, in the proper sense of ideology, that movement is easily led. And this is what the great cry from so many elements of so many quarters of the independence movement talking about, you know, Nicola Sturgeon waving carrots. It's very easy, whether it's Nicola Sturgeon or Alex Salmond or anyone else, it's very easy for a political leader to wave carrots and find followers from an activist, engaged, but uninformed mass of people.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's how it happens. In fact, that's the very essence, in a sense, of populism. Populism isn't always a bad thing. Populism is just a style of politics. And that's what breeds this style of politics, this idea of, I'm politically engaged, I want independence, or whatever your cause is, I want these things and I'm willing to do what it takes. But I haven't done the homework.
And there's the element also of the leadership or whatever appealing to populism, saying, no, we're on the side of you, we're on the side of the people,
of course,
against these other big forces.
Well, I mean, that's a particular brand of populism, and we see that in Berlusconi's Italy. We see it with Trump. Sure. We saw it with Boris Johnson. But there are other types of populism, and this carrot and stick, this constant promising of independence in Scotland, is also a different type of populism. It's not, populism isn't a type of politics, it's more like a style of doing politics, and that's that style. So when asked the question, how do we, you know, break this? How do we break this lack of information? Well, it's quite simple. To me, it comes down to each individual taking responsibility for education. You know, that we have to educate, we have to activate, we have to organize.
Yeah.
Now, it's one thing to be organized, and Scotland is, you know, as I said, 5 stars for organizational Scotland. What All Under One Banner have done, what IndyLive has done, our organization across Scotland is spectacular. It's brilliant, but it lacks this type of ideology that drives Sinn Féin in Ireland. It lacks the type of ideology that has driven and informed people on the ground in Catalonia. That these are people who have schools of political education. You know, it came as a surprise to me that there wasn't such a thing as a summer school in Scotland. Sinn Féin operates a series of summer schools where, you know, members of the party are, you know, invited to seminars throughout the year where we talk about Irish history, politics, political development, schisms within the movement. Yeah. And you find that your average Sinn Féin activist in a pub in Dublin can talk about political theory, can talk about Gramsci, Lenin, Marx, you know, not just radical left, but radical right, talk about, you know, political theorists and the pros and cons. Your ability to, I've never seen that on the Wee Ginger Dog. And I love Paul Kavanagh to bits.
No, no, he's a lovely man.
I've never seen political theory discussed, and the same true for Stu Campbell, and the same for so many of the blogs that we have. No one is delving into the ideology that drives movements and makes them autogeneic rather than led. That we need a grassroots-driven movement for independence. That's what actually affects change. That's what happened in Estonia. It's what happened in Hungary. It's what happened in Slovakia. That we didn't have a political leader. Let me tell you your politics.
Yeah.
Well, that's dangerous. That's
just to get through the questions before we wrap it up. What do you think ALBA is going to do in the next few years?
I don't know. I'm watching it, very interested in it. Again, I would say that the same as my support for AFI and my support for the ISP was what I see as the importance of ALBA and these other parties is the notional understanding of a supermajority. And that's, you know, a fully democratic and legal, not gaming the system. You know, that again, that was the use of language to disable us.
Yeah.
But perfectly legal, perfectly legitimate use of our political system, a strategic. Again, this is the one thing we're not being taught is strategy. And this is the whole being led. That
the Unionists used pretty effectively, given that they were a minority in the last election.
Because they never had an empire for nothing. These are expert strategists. Yeah. You know, we are not. We've been trained to be the subjects of strategy. But if we were willing to actually be political, not be, oh no, you know, the Ruth Wishart school of we mustn't game the system. We have to be fair to our fellow Scots and have a democracy.
Yeah, like the British Empire ever was.
Nonsense. No, politics is about politics. That's politics. That if we are going to play politically and we are going to play hardball, then we use the system as it exists and we exploit it. That's what the Unionists did. That's what the Unionists have always done. And
that's what Westminster does every time when they get
I was just going to mention
35% of the vote and they get like 55% of the seats.
The very idea that, you know, we have less than 10% of the seats in Westminster is gaming the system writ large. It's a democratic slavery. Yeah. You know, it's a nonsense. So again, I would say that our best route through this is for parties like ALBA, like the ISP, like the AFI, and to use and to educate voters on the system and how to use the system strategically. And again, this isn't about Alex Salmond. You know, there has been a great deal of flack about, oh, you know, you're chasing the sex pest. A man who was found innocent, you know, but you're chasing the sex pest. In 2014, the SNP was very keen to say that independence wasn't about Alex Salmond. He was just the leader of the party. The same applies now to ALBA. He's just the leader of the party. The key goal of ALBA was a goal for the independence movement, was to create a supermajority. The only political reality that has ever been effected within the British state that beat the British state in 1919 was a supermajority in Dáil Éireann. And if we continue to get a simple majority or a near majority, I mean, that's a moral victory. And I'm delighted for the SNP. I'm delighted for the independence movement that we still maintain that power. But it's just, you know, rinse and repeat. It's what we had last time. It's the same mandate we had this last time. And it's the same mandate Westminster will just say no to.
Exactly. Do you want to talk any about your random public journal? Do you want to give a plug to that?
Oh, absolutely. If you're not reading the Random Public Journal, you're not reading anything at all. I mean, if you've been listening to me...
randompublicjournal.com. And I must confess, I just looked at it for the first time in the last couple of days after having gotten to secure the interview with you. So, you know, it was good. But
thank you. No. I mean, I'm not going to say it's the best blog out there. You know, it's not the most well-read blog out there. But, you know, it's where I get to put my musings and stuff together in some sort of systematic way, you know. But yeah, no, definitely give it a read. You know, the worst that can happen is you will absolutely hate it. You know, it will contradict your sort of fundamentalist notions of how you see the movement. But if you hate it, that's a good thing. You might disagree with me, You might think I'm wrong, but we have to have that discussion where we have point and counterpoint. We're not a mature democracy until we have people to disagree with.
Agreed.
That's my plug.
Okay, excellent. Next one, do you think we should have withdrawn from the UK as soon as Brexit was done? Then we should have suspended the union and reconvened the original Scottish government with all its powers. Then we should have withheld all taxes, and then we should have voted on dissolving the union. I guess that's kind of a, obviously that wasn't done, but I mean, do you think that we could have secured independence before now? I mean, I did a video on this with the help of Alan Knight saying, okay, dude, Scotland needs to get the fuck out now or else they're fucked. And they didn't,
Well, I would say that, yes, we could have. There was an opportunity there, but I would suspect, for all that Scotland denies the realities of British state brutality, I would suspect if we used Brexit as a way to press the ejection button and jump out of the union, that right now Glasgow would be looking pretty much like Gaza looks this morning, that the British Army would be called in, and this would be because what we would have done then was jumped out of the union undemocratically. So I'm a firm believer in a referendum. Now, I know a lot of people are talking about dissolve the union, and that there's a certain legal historical reality that if you turn the stone of destiny 3 degrees clockwise, surrounded by 40 Vestal virgins on the spring equinox, that somehow the union will dissolve like, salt into water. I don't believe in this sort of political jiggery pokery. We have to be realistic. That if we want an independence that works, it has to be done by either a plebiscite or a referendum. It needs to be democratic, because that way we do not allow for a remainder of Unionists in Scotland to apply to the British state to say, we were undemocratically robbed of our rights of British citizens, we need help. Fundamentally, that's what happened in Ireland, and that's why the British sent in the troops. It's the same why Britain sent in the troops in India and elsewhere. It's, you came for the United States. It was the Tory sentiment in the United States that appealed for the help of the Redcoats. But we didn't want independence. So we need to look at that remainder of Tories in Scotland and Unionists and give them no appeal to the union, is to say that we had a democratic vote in which you participated and you lost. And that way you secure at least the moral and democratic high ground that the international community, of which we have European preemptive favour, to say that if we can do this, secure this democratically, then we have the support of Brussels. And that's how to do it. So, yes,
we need to wrap this up, but anything you'd like to say before we say goodbye to our listeners and viewers?
Oh, what I would like to say is, that before, how do I phrase this? My message right now is that I don't believe we will have an independence referendum within the next 5 years. That's reality as it stands. What I would say to your viewers and listeners is do what you can right now to change the facts on the ground. Only the action of the grassroots can make sure that there is a referendum within the next 5 months. If left unchanged, things will remain unchanged. Only we can affect that change, and we have an obligation to Scotland, to the independence movement, and to the future of our children and grandchildren to put a fire under the bums of the people who want to remain gradualist and keep this on ice. Right on. That if there is to be a change in the next 5 years, it needs to be people like you listening who engage in political education, political activism, understand what you want and why you're doing it, and do it. That would be my only message, is don't stop.
Okay. On that note, thank you very much. We can, once Paul wraps up the thing, I'd be happy to chat for a few minutes, but thank you everybody for watching, and it's been a delight, and I will be more than happy to have you back again. It was a really interesting conversation.
Thank you very much, Mark. Yeah. Thank you.